Two families with children vanished without a trace in 1988. 25 years later, a forgotten motel basement was opened for the first time. What they found inside left even seasoned investigators shaken to their core. The summer of 1988 was unremarkable in most of America. The headlines that July were filled with politics, the Olympics in Seoul, and talk of an uncertain economy. But in one small corner of the Southwest, along a stretch of state highway where desert met farmland, two families decided to pause their road trip at a roadside motel. It was the kind of decision people made every day, casual, even forgettable. Yet it would become the last choice these families were ever known to make. The Harringtons and the Whitfields had been friends for years. Both families came from the same quiet Midwestern town, raising kids on baseball, school fundraisers, and Friday night cookouts. To celebrate the end of a long school year, they'd decided on a joint trip west. The plan was simple. Drive through New Mexico and Arizona, see the Grand Canyon, and give the kids the kind of adventure they'd remember for a lifetime. Photographs taken during those first days of the trip show what you'd expect. Fathers with sunburned faces leaning proudly on the hood of the station wagon. Mothers in denim shorts and pastel blouses, balancing paper cups of soda in their hands. Four young boys in striped t-shirts, socks rolled down at the ankle. The look of boundless energy written across their smiles. And the youngest, a little girl with blonde hair, always clinging to her mother's hand. Nothing about the images suggests that anything was wrong. These were families on the move, caught in the frozen warmth of summer snapshots. The motel where they stopped sat just off the highway, its neon sign reading simply, Motel. It wasn't a chain, it wasn't fancy, but in 1988, that didn't matter. Roadside motels were woven into the fabric of American travel. They were affordable, convenient, and everywhere. Tired parents didn't think twice about pulling into one when the kids had grown restless in the back seat. To the Harringtons and Whitfields, it was just one night's rest before moving on. The desk clerk later told investigators that the two families checked in just before dusk. They rented two adjoining rooms on the ground floor, rooms 6 and 7, facing the parking lot. The fathers carried in duffel bags, the mothers shepherded the kids, and by all accounts, spirits were high. The children darted between the cars and the walkway, their laughter echoing against the stucco walls. To the clerk, they were no different from the dozens of other travelers who stopped there each week. He handed them their keys, took their payment in cash, and thought nothing of it. That night, witnesses at a nearby diner recalled seeing the group eating dinner together. Burgers and fries for the kids, coffee for the adults. One waitress remembered the little girl falling asleep in her mother's lap, her head pressed against her shoulder. Around 9:30 p.m., the families returned to the motel. Another guest, a trucker, noticed the fathers carrying sodas and snacks into the rooms. The families laughed loudly enough that he remembered wishing they would quiet down before he turned in for the night. That was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. The next morning, everything was wrong. By the time housekeeping made their rounds, both rooms were empty. The beds appeared, slept in, the bathrooms used. Toothbrushes and toiletries were still on the counter. A child's stuffed animal sat neatly on one of the pillows, but the families themselves were gone. Their cars, parked outside, remained untouched. Wallets, purses, and even half-drunk cans of soda were still in the room. It looked as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. When the motel manager couldn't locate them, he first assumed they had left early to beat the heat. But by afternoon, their cars were still there. He contacted the local sheriff, and within hours, deputies were inspecting the rooms. At first, there was no panic. People went missing in ordinary ways all the time. Maybe they'd taken a walk, maybe they'd caught a bus. But as the day turned into night, unease spread. Nothing about the scene added up. Investigators quickly established that no one had seen the families leave. The clerk who had worked the night shift swore he hadn't noticed them depart. The trucker guest said he left before dawn and hadn't heard a thing. No one had checked out at the desk. And the cars, those heavy, gas-guzzling wagons of the 80s, stood like mute witnesses, still in their parking spaces, still with coolers in the back filled with food for the journey ahead. For the local sheriff's office, it was unlike anything they had encountered. A whole group of people, 2 mothers, 2 fathers, 4 children, had simply disappeared into thin air, and the motel, a place built for transients, offered little help. Strangers came and went every day. Guest records were spotty, receipts hastily written in a ledger. Even the payphone in the lobby provided no clue. No calls had been logged after midnight. By the time the FBI was called in, days had already passed, and whatever trace might have existed had been swallowed by time. News spread quickly. Newspapers ran front-page stories with the family's photographs. Local TV stations sent reporters to film outside the motel, its neon sign flickering against the desert dusk. Viewers across the country shuddered at the thought. If 2 ordinary families could vanish from a roadside stop, who was safe? Parents began double-checking motel locks, listening for every sound in the night. And in the small Midwestern town the Harringtons and Whitfields had left behind, neighbors gathered nightly on porches, staring into the distance, waiting for news that never came. But behind the headlines and the televised appeals, something darker was already taking root. For every official who insisted this was a disappearance with an explanation, there were whispers that the truth was stranger. Some locals believed the motel itself was cursed, built on bad ground, a place people were never meant to stay. Others spoke in hushed tones about a drifter seen near the highway that night, a man with no name who sometimes camped in abandoned buildings. Still others speculated about the motel staff, who seemed too calm, too indifferent, as though they knew more than they were saying. What no one knew, what no one could know, was that the answer lay not above ground, but beneath it. In 1988, the basement of that motel was sealed, its door hidden beneath a layer of laundry machines and storage. Few even remembered it existed. But in the years to come, as the motel aged and the story of the vanished families faded into urban legend, that basement would wait silently, holding its secret. For the family's loved ones, the early days were the hardest. The Harringtons' eldest boy had just celebrated his 10th birthday. His grandparents still had the cake tin on their counter when they got the call. The Whitfields' youngest, the blonde little girl, had left behind a drawing taped to her refrigerator. At home, both families had left neighbors with spare house keys, promises to return within 2 weeks. Instead, the houses sat quiet, curtains drawn, mail piling up. Within weeks, the children's schools held vigils, classmates clutching candles in the hot summer air. Teachers spoke about innocence lost. Friends whispered questions no one could answer. And all the while, the motel remained open, rooms rented, nightly to other travelers who had no idea that just weeks before, 2 families had disappeared from its walls. Guests slept in the same rooms, pulled open the same curtains, walked across the same parking lot, never realizing they were stepping into a place already haunted. The FBI's early investigation turned up nothing definitive. They interviewed staff, checked fingerprints, even brought in cadaver dogs. But the desert winds erased traces quickly. The dogs alerted faintly near a back stairwell, but nothing was found. Without bodies, without witnesses, the case began to stall. And yet, the motel's manager, when questioned years later, admitted something chilling. In the days after the disappearance, he said, the basement door was locked. He had forgotten it even existed until then. But later, when he tried it again, it was blocked from the inside. That detail wouldn't matter for another 25 years. For now, in 1988, the families were simply gone. Their cars were eventually impounded, their possessions catalogued and boxed. Their photographs, once cheerful reminders of a summer trip, became evidence. And the motel, though still in operation, carried a stain no advertisement could wash away. By the end of that summer, the story had slipped from national headlines. New tragedies took its place. But in one town, 2 sets of grandparents kept lights burning in their windows, refusing to give up hope. And in the desert, along that forgotten highway, the motel stood waiting, its neon sign buzzing faintly, its windows reflecting empty skies. To passing motorists, it was just another stop. To those who knew, it was the place where 2 families had vanished into silence. And though no one could prove it, some swore that on certain nights, if you drove, Passed slowly and rolled down your window, you could hear children's laughter drifting faintly from the dark. The motel didn't close right away. For a time, it continued as if nothing had happened. Travelers still pulled off the highway, checked into their rooms, and laid their heads on the same pillows where the Harringtons and Whitfields had last slept. Housekeepers still vacuumed the carpets, emptied the trash bins, and scrubbed bathrooms where toothbrushes and combs had once been left behind in a rush. But the silence in rooms 6 and 7 was never quite the same. The disappearance lingered like smoke. Guests whispered in the hallways. Some refused to stay in those 2 adjoining rooms, even after the motel repainted and rearranged the furniture. Parents pulled their children close, double-checked the locks, and asked one another what could make 2 families vanish without a trace. Locals began avoiding the property. It was bad luck, they said. Some claimed the neon sign flickered more. Harshly after that summer, its buzzing louder, almost angry. Others swore they heard faint voices when they passed the building at night. Children's laughter carried on the desert wind, cut short by sudden silence. By the early 1990s, business had dropped sharply. Travelers didn't want to stay at a place known nationally for a disappearance. Reporters occasionally returned, shooting updates against the backdrop of the weathered stucco walls. Each time the motel's name hit the news, cancellations spiked again. By 1995, several of the rooms were permanently closed. Curtains hung limp, fabric sun-bleached and stiff. The once bright red doors faded to rusted pink. The town itself couldn't shake the shadow of the case. It was a small place, and for years, it was defined not by what it had built, but by what it had lost. Kids in the local school grew up with the story of the motel families. Teenagers dared one another to sneak onto the property after dark, touching the door handles of rooms 6 and 7 before sprinting away, hearts pounding. Adults lowered their voices whenever the subject came up in diners or barber shops. For the Harringtons and Whitfields' relatives, the years were brutal. At first, they clung to hope. Flyers were printed. Tips were chased down across state lines. There were reported sightings in bus stations, in border towns, even in Las Vegas casinos. Each one sparked a rush of hope, followed inevitably by disappointment. The sightings were always wrong. The families were never there. Time passed, but grief doesn't follow the clock. Birthdays arrived that the children never reached. The little blonde girl, only 5 when she vanished, would have been a teenager by the mid-90s. Her mother kept her bedroom intact for years. The pink sheets never changed. Her dolls lined up as if waiting. For the Harringtons' eldest, a boy. Just turning 10 at the time, his grandparents marked each year with a cake, candles burning in silence before they were quietly blown out. As the FBI investigation cooled, frustration turned into bitterness. Some relatives accused the motel owners of covering something up. Others directed their anger at law enforcement, believing crucial hours had been wasted at the start. Lawsuits were threatened but went nowhere. Without bodies, without evidence, there was nothing to press forward. By the late 1990s, the case had slipped from headlines. Other tragedies took center stage. High-profile kidnappings, national disasters, new wars. But the motel remained. Fewer and fewer travelers pulled into its lot, paint peeled from its sign. The pool, once sparkling blue, became a swamp of green water and mosquitoes. The owners sold it in 2001 to an investor who promised renovations. But by then the reputation was cemented. No one wanted to stay in a place locals called cursed. The building began to rot from the inside. Ceilings sagged from water damage, furniture mildewed, windows broke and were left unrepaired, vandals spray-painted. The stucco walls, carving obscenities into doors. By 2005, the neon sign no longer lit at all. The once bright red letters reading simply, Motel, now rust-colored and bent. The motel was dead, but the legend was very much alive. True crime magazines revisited the case every few years, framing it as one of America's great unsolved mysteries. Paranormal shows spun ghost stories out of it, claiming spirits lingered in the abandoned rooms. Amateur sleuths debated theories online. Was it a cult? A serial killer passing through? A motel? Owner with a hidden past? Each theory seemed possible, yet none fit cleanly. The strangeness of the disappearance, the total absence of evidence, made the case impossible to solve and impossible to forget. For locals, the legend became part of their identity. Some resented it, tired of reporters asking about the vanishing motel. Others leaned into it, telling exaggerated versions of the story to tourists or campers, adding flourishes about bloodstains on the carpet or screams heard at night. But beneath the embellishments, the raw truth remained the same. 2 families had checked in and never checked out. By the 20th anniversary in 2008, the motel was nothing but a shell. Grass pushed through cracks in the parking lot. Doors hung open, exposing dark rooms littered with debris. The town decided to hold a memorial vigil at the site, inviting the family's relatives and surviving friends. Candles flickered in front of the ruined building as locals bowed their heads. It was meant to be a solemn moment of remembrance. But something happened that night. A local news crew, filming the vigil, panned their camera across the shattered windows of the motel. When they replayed the footage later, viewers noticed something unsettling. In the lower corner of a basement window, mostly obscured by grime and boards, there appeared to be movement, a flicker of shadow, a shifting shape that didn't belong. The footage was grainy, inconclusive. Some said it was just a trick of light, a reflection from the candles. Others swore they saw a figure, a childlike silhouette pressed against the glass, gone in an instant. The station dismissed. It is nothing more than pareidolia, the mind's tendency to see patterns where none exist. But for those who had lived with the mystery for 2 decades, it was enough to reignite old fears. The idea that the motel still held secrets, that its locked basement might hide the answers, spread like wildfire. But no one went down there. By then, the building was considered unsafe, its floors unstable, its walls crumbling. The county taped off the property, declaring it condemned. It stood untouched, waiting as years stretched on. For the families left behind, the vigil was another bitter reminder. 20 years gone, and still no answers. Children who had vanished were now older than their parents had been when they disappeared. Time had folded in on itself, leaving wounds that never healed. The grandparents who once lit candles each year were passing away, one by one, without ever knowing the truth. And yet, in the silence of the abandoned motel, something waited, a forgotten door, hidden behind machines and boxes in the old laundry room, remained locked. Few remembered it even existed. Fewer still had reason to pry it open. But behind that door was the basement. And within that basement, the story that had haunted the town for 25 years had been preserved in darkness, waiting to be uncovered. By the mid-2010s, the story of the vanished families was remembered only in fragments. Younger generations in the town had grown up driving past the abandoned motel without knowing the full history. For them, it was simply a ruin on the roadside, a relic of a time before chain hotels and fast food exits took over the highways. But for those old enough to remember, the building was a scar. In 2013, the case quietly resurfaced. It wasn't the FBI that stirred it up this time. It wasn't even law enforcement. It was a journalist. Claire Sanderson had been a freelance reporter most of her career, specializing in forgotten crimes. She was the type who thrived on cold cases, not the daily churn of politics and traffic accidents. When she first stumbled across a reference to the motel families while researching another story, she was stunned. 8 people, 2 entire families, had vanished, and yet she had never heard of it. Her curiosity became obsession. She traveled to the small town that summer, staying in a cheap rental just miles from the abandoned motel. The locals weren't eager to talk. By then, the case had hardened into something like superstition. People shook their heads when she asked about it. Some told her to leave it alone. A few even refused to say the motel's name out loud, as if speaking it would invite trouble. But Claire was persistent. She tracked down retired deputies, former motel staff, and even surviving relatives. Slowly, she pieced together the story as it had been understood in 1988. The cheerful road trip, the quiet night, the rooms left behind like a frozen moment. What struck her most was the consistency of the accounts. Everyone remembered the same details. The cereal cup on the nightstand, the car still in the lot, the belongings untouched. and yet no one could explain how an entire group could vanish so completely. Her digging took her into county archives, where boxes of dusty case files had been left untouched for decades. It was there she found something others had missed. Buried. In an old report was a single line: "Canine alert. Basement entrance. No access granted." The note was dated just 2 days after the disappearance. A search dog had reacted near the motel's back stairwell, but at the time, the basement was locked. Investigators hadn't pressed the issue. They assumed it was a false signal. Claire read the line over and over, her pulse quickening. Why hadn't anyone followed up? Why hadn't they forced that door open? The more she looked, the stranger it became. Building permits from the 1970s listed a basement beneath the motel, originally used for storage and maintenance, but later documents, including tax assessments from the 1980s, omitted it entirely. It was as if the basement had been erased from the record. Claire began asking questions. Who built the motel? Who owned it at the time? What had happened to those owners after the disappearance? The trail led her to a series of complicated property transfers and a holding company with no clear identity. On paper, the motel had been bought and sold multiple times in the late 80s and 90s, often between shell companies. Money shifted hands, but no one seemed to know who was really in control. That raised another possibility. What if the motel had been more than just a roadside business? What if it had been a front for something else? The idea seemed far-fetched, but Claire knew better than to dismiss it. She dug deeper. Eventually, she found whispers in old financial reports linking the motel's ownership to a man known for shady dealings across the Southwest. Loans, gambling debts, even rumored ties to organized crime. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise suspicion. By now, Claire had convinced herself the motel's basement was key. She arranged to tour the property, though it was considered condemned. With a local contractor as her escort, she stepped into the decaying halls for the first time. The air was thick with dust and mold. Ceiling tiles sagged. Graffiti covered the walls. Obscene drawings, teenage taunts, the word "cursed" scrawled in black spray paint across the lobby wall. She walked the length of the corridor where rooms 6 and 7 had once stood. Their doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, the numbers long since pried off by souvenir hunters. The rooms themselves were gutted, mattresses torn open, plaster cracked, floorboards warped by water damage. And yet Claire felt a chill as she stood there. She imagined the families laughing as they carried in their bags, the children running, circles on the thin carpet. The silence now was deafening. Finally, she made her way to the back, where the laundry room had once operated. Machines were still there, rusted hulks, doors wrenched open like mouths frozen in a scream. Boxes of broken furniture and debris were piled high, nearly blocking a section of wall. It was there, half hidden behind the wreckage, that Claire saw it, a metal door, rusted, padlocked, faded with time, but unmistakably a door. Her contractor. Guide frowned when she pointed it out. "That just leads to a crawlspace," he muttered. But Claire wasn't so sure. She remembered the line from the case file. Basement entrance. This had to be it. She tugged at the handle. It didn't move. The padlock was fused with rust, the hinges stiff. But the door was real. The basement existed. And for 25 years, no one had opened it. That night she wrote in her notes, "The motel is hiding something." The basement was sealed. Why? Word of her discovery spread quickly. Locals who had scoffed at her questions now whispered again. Some warned her to stop digging. Others quietly encouraged her, admitting they had always believed the motel's basement held the truth. Claire pressed the county for access. At first, officials resisted. The building was unsafe, they said. But as pressure grew, and as her reporting gained traction in regional news, they relented. In early 2014, for the first time since 1988, the basement door was scheduled to be opened. As the date drew closer, Claire found herself unable to sleep. She pored over photographs of the families, staring into the innocent faces of the children. She thought about the stuffed animal left on the pillow, the half-drunk soda cans, the shoes lined neatly against the wall. They had gone to bed expecting tomorrow. She wondered what they had found instead. The night before the scheduled entry, Claire drove out to the motel alone. She parked in the cracked lot, headlights illuminating the rusted sign. She sat there for an hour, staring at the building, the desert wind rattling the weeds. She swore she could feel eyes watching from the darkened windows. She wrote one final note in her journal. If the basement is opened, the truth will finally come out. But what if we're not ready for it? The morning the basement was scheduled to be opened, the motel's cracked parking lot was busier than it had been in years. County officials stood alongside local deputies, an FBI liaison, and a small crowd of curious onlookers who had heard the whispers. Most were townsfolk who had grown up with the legend. They wanted to see for themselves what had been hidden for 25 years. At the edge of the lot, Claire Sanderson stood with her notebook in hand, her pen tapping nervously against its spiral. She'd been the one to rediscover the basement door, the one to push county officials to act. Now that the day had arrived, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. This wasn't just a forgotten piece of architecture. This was potentially the key to 8 vanished lives. The building itself seemed to groan as the crew moved inside. Dust motes swirled in shafts of sunlight that slipped through broken windows. The smell of mildew and decay was strong, layered with years of abandonment. When they reached the laundry room, the workers cleared away boxes, broken furniture, and rusted machines. And there it was. The metal door, its surface blistered with rust, its hinges fused with time. The county official nodded. "Open it." A grinder screamed to life, showering sparks as it chewed through the old padlock. Onlookers shielded their eyes as metal split. With a final kick from one of the deputies, the door swung open, releasing a gust of air so stale and heavy it made several people gag. The opening revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The steps were concrete, cracked but solid. A single bare bulb hung overhead, long dead. The air smelled of damp earth, dust, and something else, something that clawed faintly at the back of the throat. Claire felt her stomach tighten. She steadied her pen as she wrote. First descent into basement. Air foul. Smell. Not just mold. Deputies led the way down, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The beam revealed walls of rough cinder block, the ceiling low enough to brush fingertips against. The basement was larger than anyone had expected. It stretched beneath much of the motel, a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small chambers. At first, it looked like storage. Old crates lined the walls. A rusted workbench sagged under the weight of broken tools. Tangled wires hung from the ceiling. But as they moved deeper, the atmosphere shifted. In one chamber, deputies found crude bedding, thin, stained mattresses spread across the floor. Blankets rotted into rags. Tin cans and bottles littered the corners. One deputy bent down and picked up a child's shoe, its leather cracked but still intact. He held it up in silence, the beam of his flashlight catching the small scuffed sole. Claire's pen trembled as she scribbled furiously. Children's belongings. Shoe, evidence of habitation, not just storage. Another chamber held restraints. Chains bolted into the wall, cuffs still attached. The rust was deep, the metal corroded. But the purpose was unmistakable. Deputies exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke for several moments. Against another wall was something stranger. License plates. A dozen of them. Some bent, some rusted, arranged in a crude stack. None matched the family's cars, but their presence raised questions. How many others had passed through this place? The most chilling discovery came in what seemed to be the central chamber. On the floor lay a pile of objects that had no reason to be there together. A child's backpack with faded cartoon characters, a woman's purse still containing a lipstick tube, a man's pocket knife with initials carved into the handle. Each item was bagged carefully by evidence technicians, but their weight in the room was unbearable. Claire stood near the back, her throat dry, her notes barely legible. She couldn't shake the thought that these were the last belongings of people who had been silenced in this very place. And yet, no bodies. The basement held signs of life, signs of captivity, signs of something sinister. but no remains. The most important question remained unanswered. What had happened to the Harringtons and Whitfields? Then a deputy's flashlight caught something odd. Along one wall, the cinder blocks looked different. Newer, cleaner, as if they had been replaced more recently than the rest. The mortar lines were sharper, the surface smoother. "Get a hammer," the sheriff said quietly. The crew went to work. Each strike echoed through the basement, dust filling the air. The wall cracked, splintered, pieces of cinder block tumbled to the floor, and then finally a hole opened into darkness beyond. The smell that poured out was unmistakable this time. Rot. Old, sour, clinging to everything. Deputies covered their faces as they widened the opening. Flashlights pierced through and landed on what lay inside. It was a cavity, a hidden room behind the wall, and within it, shapes slumped against one another, long since collapsed into stillness. Bones. The chamber held human remains, several sets. The room fell silent except for the sound of someone retching. Evidence technicians moved in, their gloved hands trembling as they began their grim work. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all jumbled together in the darkness. It would take months for forensic teams to sort and identify them, but in that moment, everyone in the basement understood. The motel had been hiding the truth all along. Claire turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. She had wanted answers. She had demanded them. But staring into that hidden chamber, she realized answers carried their own kind of horror. When she finally steadied herself, she wrote one last note for the day. Basement wall concealed bodies, not all accounted for. Families may be among them, but why here? Why sealed? The news broke within hours. By nightfall, headlines across the country screamed the discovery. Remains found in abandoned motel basement could solve 25-year mystery. For the first time in a generation, the story of the Harringtons and Whitfields dominated front pages and television screens. In their hometown back in the Midwest, families gathered around televisions, hands gripping one another tightly as images of the ruined motel played on the evening news. Many had grown old waiting for this day. Some were gone now, grandparents who had died without answers. But the younger relatives were still there, staring wide-eyed as anchors described bones pulled from behind a false wall. Children's belongings scattered in the dust. The FBI confirmed within days that at least some of the remains belonged to the missing families. Dental records matched 2 adults, later confirmed to be the fathers, Robert Harrington and James Whitfield. Weeks later, DNA analysis identified 2 of the boys, but not everyone. The mother's remains weren't found, nor were 2 of the children. 4 accounted for, 4 still missing. The partial identifications left investigators in a strange position. On one hand, they had proof the families had been murdered. On the other, the absence of half their number suggested something else. Had the others been buried elsewhere? Had they been taken alive? And if so, why? Forensics teams spent months combing the chamber. Soil samples, insect remains, even traces of fibers were analyzed. Specialists built timelines of decomposition, narrowing down the window of death to the summer of 1988. The bodies had been placed there deliberately, the wall erected soon after. Whoever had sealed that room had meant for it never to be opened. But the biggest question loomed larger with each passing week. Who had done it? At first, suspicion fell once again on the motel's owners at the time. Interviews revealed inconsistencies in their statements. One former housekeeper recalled being told never to enter the basement, even before the disappearance. Another former employee admitted the owners kept odd hours, sometimes entertaining businessmen late at night who never stayed in the guest rooms, but the owners themselves were gone. Both had died years earlier, one of illness, the other in a car crash. No direct testimony could be gathered, no charges filed. All that remained were fragments, financial records, property deeds, and whispers. Claire Sanderson, the journalist who had reignited the case, dug into those records. What she found made her blood run cold. The motel had been sold twice in the months before the families vanished. The transactions led to a shell company registered out of Nevada. Further digging revealed the name of a man often tied to gambling halls, loan sharking, and rumored trafficking routes across the Southwest. He had never been convicted of anything major, but his name appeared again and again in connection to disappeared people, mostly transient, mostly poor. It painted a chilling possibility. The families had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. A motel operating as a front for organized crime. A basement used for purposes darker than anyone had guessed. Still, nothing explained the missing four. Theories bloomed like wildfire. Some investigators believed the women and children had been taken alive, possibly trafficked, their remains buried elsewhere. Others suspected that the chamber had been larger at one time and collapsed, scattering remains in ways that confused analysis. But Claire latched onto another possibility, one raised quietly by a retired FBI agent she interviewed off the record. What if they weren't random victims? He asked. What if they were targets? The idea unsettled her. Both families were ordinary, middle-class Midwesterners, no known debts, no known enemies. But as she dug deeper into their pasts, small cracks appeared. Robert Harrington, the father, had once testified in a minor fraud case against a businessman tied loosely to the same networks now under suspicion. James Whitfield had been an accountant at a firm later investigated for laundering money. Both connections seemed distant, coincidental, until you considered the timing. A summer trip west, an unplanned stop at a motel possibly linked to the same networks. Was it chance, or had they been watched? The surviving relatives bristled at the suggestion. To them, the families had been blameless, innocent victims who had the misfortune of stopping at the wrong place. And yet, as Claire reviewed the documents, she couldn't shake the thought that someone had wanted them silenced. Law enforcement, too, found themselves pulled in multiple directions. The sheriff's office leaned toward the theory of random violence tied to the motel's criminal connections. The FBI, pressured by the resurfacing media coverage, began reopening old case files from the late 80s and early 90s. They looked for patterns, missing travelers, unclaimed bodies, whispers of desert graves. Red herrings abounded. A former handyman, long suspected by locals, resurfaced in rumor, but he had died in prison years earlier on unrelated charges. A drifter once seen near the highway was interviewed, but his alibi remained intact. Even an unrelated string of child abductions in Arizona briefly drew attention, until investigators ruled them out. Each lead fizzled, but each added to the growing sense of dread. Whoever had orchestrated the murders had been careful. They had left behind bones, yes, but no fingerprints, no weapons, no paper trail. The false wall had bought them decades of silence. By late 2014, the town itself was in turmoil. The motel, already a ruin, was now swarmed with outsiders. Journalists camped out. Paranormal enthusiasts filmed themselves sneaking through the halls at night, live streaming their investigations. Relatives of the missing stood outside the taped perimeter, watching with hollow eyes as strangers trampled the ground where their loved ones had vanished. The sheriff called for calm, but whispers grew louder. Some locals accused law enforcement of knowing more than they were saying. Others feared that digging too deep into the motel's past would bring retaliation from powerful people who had once profited from it. In her small rental, Claire typed late into the night, piecing together everything she had learned. She wrote about the father's possible connections, the motel's shady ownership, the missing mothers and children. Her editor urged caution, too many allegations, too little proof. But Claire knew she was circling something real, something buried not just in the motel's basement, but in decades of silence and fear. One evening, while reviewing property maps, she noticed something peculiar. The basement's official blueprints ended at the wall where the remains were found, but county survey maps from the 1970s showed an additional section, a chamber that no longer appeared in later documents. Had it been filled in? Collapsed? Or sealed deliberately, like the false wall? Claire leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. If another chamber existed, it might hold the missing. Or it might hold something else entirely. Records, evidence, the final piece of the puzzle. She closed her notebook with trembling hands. She was in too deep now. The discovery of the bones should have been the end of the story. For many, it was. Newspapers declared the Motel family's mystery solved, case closed. But Claire Sanderson couldn't let it rest. Too many questions remained. Why half the group was missing, why the basement had been erased from records, and why the motel's ownership trail vanished into the same shadows that had swallowed the families. In late 2015, after months of lobbying, the county allowed a deeper excavation of the basement. Engineers shored up the collapsing structure, clearing debris and reinforcing the cracked walls. Claire stood nearby when surveyors confirmed what she had suspected. There was indeed a second chamber. It lay beyond the wall where the bodies had been found, filled in with soil decades earlier. The decision to open it wasn't taken lightly. Officials debated safety, funding, even public perception. But pressure from families, combined with Claire's relentless reporting, forced their hand. One cold morning in January 2016, heavy equipment rumbled into the motel lot. Workers chipped away at the wall, shovels and drills biting into packed earth. When they broke through, the smell came first, a heavy, sour rot that had never fully left, preserved by soil and stone. Then the lights shone in. The chamber was smaller than expected, more like a dugout pit than a finished room, and in it, they found what the families had feared for 27 years. 4 bodies, 2 women, 2 children. The remains were fragile, bones collapsed into the soil, but enough clothing fragments survived to confirm identities. A floral blouse, a child's summer dress, a pair of sneakers with rainbow laces. Within weeks, DNA confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The missing members of the Harrington and Whitfield families had been found. The truth had been buried all along, just a few feet deeper than anyone had looked. But the question remained, who had put them there? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. Among the soil and debris of the second chamber, investigators found a box. It was badly water damaged, its wood warped, but inside were documents sealed in plastic sleeves. Notes, receipts, ledgers. They had been hidden along with the bodies, perhaps overlooked by those who buried them. Forensic accountants pored over the papers, and slowly, a picture emerged. The motel had indeed been a front. The documents linked it directly to a regional fund, a seemingly legitimate financial entity that had funneled money into local developments, charities, and political campaigns. But beneath the surface, it was laundering cash for organized crime, smuggling, gambling, and, most disturbingly, trafficking. The Harringtons and Whitfields had not been random victims. They had stumbled into something they were never meant to see. According to investigators, the family's mistake was simple but fatal. On the night of their stay, they had returned from dinner just as a meeting was taking place in the motel office. Witnesses had long reported businessmen coming and going after hours, but no one had thought much of it at the time. That night, the family's laughter, the noise of the children, drew attention. Someone realized they had seen too much. The decision was made quickly. They would not leave the motel alive. The men involved, their names found in the recovered ledgers, were never tried. Many were already dead, their lives claimed by age, disease, or the violent retribution that often comes with organized crime. A few were still alive, but untouchable, their lawyers shielding them from direct implication. What remained was the paper trail, damning but incomplete, enough to explain motive if not to prosecute. For the families back home, the revelations were both closure and torment. They finally knew what had happened, but the knowledge cut deeper than ignorance. Their loved ones had been murdered not by chance, not by a random predator, but because they were ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of a secret world of money and power. At a press conference, the surviving relatives stood side by side, photographs of the vanished families held in their hands. One of the grandmothers, now frail and trembling, spoke softly into the microphone. For 27 years we prayed for answers. Now we know. They never left that place, and they never will. The motel itself was demolished that summer. The county leveled the structure, filling in the basement and paving over the lot. Some argued it should have been preserved as a memorial, but the families disagreed. They wanted no monument to that place. They wanted it gone. Claire reported every detail. Her articles picked up nationally. She became known as the journalist who had forced the truth into daylight. Yet in her private notes, she confessed to nightmares, dreams of the basement, of children's shoes in the dark, of laughter echoing against concrete walls. The story of the Motel families passed once, again into history, but this time it carried an ending. 8 lives lost, 2 families silenced, a motel erased from the map. The lesson lingered like a shadow. Sometimes the most ordinary places, a roadside stop, a cheap room for the night, are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. The mystery that haunted a town for 25 years had been solved. But for the Harringtons and Whitfields, the answers came too late. And as the motel's rubble settled into dust, one truth remained. Evil can hide in plain sight, waiting for the unlucky to stumble across its door.